Hi guys, Brian from Boas here. As you may have heard me say before, in my opinion, photography is one of the most essential skills that a boa breeder can have. In fact, it may well be second only to producing the baby boas. Today I'm going to do the first in a series of videos where I discuss photographing boas and other reptiles. In this video I'm going to discuss your choice of camera for boa photography, as well as a little bit about exposure theory. So to start, I'll just reiterate how important I think it is for a boa breeder to be successful to have good photography skills. There are some breeders out there who produce amazing quality animals, but unfortunately they lack the really good photography skills, and they're selling their animals short. It's actually better to have really high quality pictures of medium quality animals than it is to have really high quality animals with low quality photographs. People are really visually oriented and they want to see high quality photos that are representative of your animals so they can decide whether or not they want to add them to your collection. So it's really imperative that you do your best to produce very high quality photos so as to not sell your animals short. This is the first in a series of videos I'm going to do. Today I'm going to cover camera choice for photographing boas, as well as a little bit about the basics of exposure. And in future videos I'm going to cover other topics like composition, lens selection, lighting, digital processing, and photographic vision. And these videos are really just a starting point. Photography is this immense subject I've been studying for decades and I still have so much to learn. So I recommend that you maybe take some ideas from these videos and seek out other sources of information when you're doing your own photographic education. So the skills that make a person a good boa photographer are really no different than what makes them a good landscape photographer or portrait photographer or any other type of photographer. And I actually started off in photography doing large format landscapes and did a lot of photography with a large format film camera. Although in the last few years I've gone more and more towards the digital end, and all of my boa photography is done using digital cameras. And I'm going to just give a real brief overview of what you should look for in a camera for your boa. So there's really two things that are essential for a camera that you're going to use for photographing boas. So they are interchangeable lenses, so you can remove lenses from the camera and choose from a whole selection of different lenses, and also so you can control your exposure. You can put in what f-stop you want, what film speed, what ISO setting, etc. It's really imperative that you can control the exposure and you're not at the mercy of the camera deciding the exposure for you. With that being said, I do use my cell phone camera for really quick sales pictures if I want to take a picture of a boa really quickly and just email it to somebody. But I don't really have any control over those pictures. So that is only for quick snapshots. And although you can certainly take some good pictures with a cell phone camera, if you really want to do the best as far as boa photography, I would recommend that you get either a digital SLR like this one or a mirrorless system. And these cameras allow you to remove the lens and to use a whole bunch of different lenses, and also they allow you to determine the parameters of the exposure for your photograph. Photography is an art form where the practitioners are really obsessed with the equipment. It's very technically oriented. And often a question that someone will ask a photographer when they see a really nice photo is, what camera did you use to take that photo? And there's this misconception that the camera is really important, more so important than the photographer. And imagine if you heard a classical pianist and playing a Beethoven piano sonata and did this fantastic job. Would you go up to them and say, what piano did you use to play that piece of music? No, that would be just ridiculous, because we know it's the pianist, not the piano. And it's the same thing with photography. It's the photographer that determines the quality of the photos, not really the camera. So there are literally thousands and thousands of different cameras you can choose from, which are all fantastic for photographing boas. In fact, every time I look at a camera catalog, it's kind of overwhelming. And they keep coming out with more and more and more. And people think they need the latest and greatest. But really, any camera that came out probably in the last 10 or even 15 years can be perfectly acceptable for taking photographs of your Boas. In fact, my number one main camera, my workhorse camera, is a Canon 7D, which is about 10 years old, and it's actually filming this video right now. And I use that for about 90% of my Boa photography. This is a newer Canon that I picked up a few years ago. It's a higher resolution model, but I don't really use it that much because my 7D is such a great camera, I don't need to use this. The skill of the photographer is far more important than what camera he or she uses. You can give an adequate camera to a great photographer, they're going to take great photos. You could give the latest and greatest camera with all the bells and whistles that just came out and cost tens of thousands of dollars to a lousy photographer, they're going to take lousy photos. So don't get overly obsessed with the equipment. Just choose a good quality, adequate camera and study how to use it to take the best photos. People are also obsessed with the brand. There's Canon, Nikon, Fuji, Sony, Pentax, and there's a whole bunch of others. They all make really high quality photos. You probably noticed I'm using Canon equipment. I've used Nikon equipment before. You know, people are emotionally attached either to the Canon or Nikon, kind of like Chevy versus Ford. But the truth is they all make excellent quality cameras. The reason I go with Canon is there is a little bit more of a selection of cameras in Canon as far as high megapixels, which I like for my landscape photography. And the lens selection appears to be a little bit better with Canon. There's more of a range of lenses. But, you know, other types of camera manufacturers make great cameras also. Just to repeat, you should look for a camera though that allows you to remove the lenses and use interchangeable lenses and allows you to control the settings like the f-stop, the shutter speed, the ISO setting, etc. And that really comes down to two choices, a digital SLR like this or a mirrorless camera system. When you choose the specific model of camera that you're going to go with, you want to look at the different features that each camera offers and pick a model that has the features you're looking for. For example, the size of the sensor in megapixels determines the resolution. You may be interested in cameras that can shoot well in very low lighting conditions and have very high ISO settings. You might want cameras with very fast autofocus systems for tracking moving subjects. You might want cameras that can shoot many frames per second, like 8 frames per second to shoot moving wildlife, things like that. And pick a camera that has the features that are going to enable you to do the photography you want. And that being said, as I mentioned before, there are thousands and thousands of cameras out there that are all perfectly capable of taking, you know, top quality pictures. So don't over obsess about what camera you're using. Get very high quality, you know, the best quality camera you can find, and then you want to study the manual. You really want to know how to use your camera, and you want to practice, and you want to do test shots. You know, the more you practice your camera, the better photographer you get. It's not unlike practicing a musical instrument. And when you look at these manuals that come with them, it can be a little overwhelming because there's so many features and so many settings and so many things they do. You don't need to know all of this. You just need to get a work frame or a workflow rather that works for you. So basically a series of steps you're going to use to take your pictures. And once you have that workflow in your head and you know exactly how to do it, you can just repeat it automatically when it comes to taking your photographs. So now that you have your camera, the other topic I'm going to discuss in this video is photographic exposure. An exposure is the series of settings on your camera that determine how much light is going to enter to strike the sensor in the camera and form the image. And there's really three main variables which determine the exposure. There's the f-stop, there's the shutter speed, and then there's the ISO or sensitivity of the sensor. And when we think about this, usually the ISO is set constant, like a speed of 100, 200, 400, and we really only think about two things that determine it, the f-stop and the shutter speed. And there's a reciprocity between the two. So in other words, as you increase one, you decrease the other. And I'll get to that in a minute. But first I just wanted to say the f-stop is really the fraction of the focal length of the lens that the aperture opens up to let light in. And I'll just explain that maybe a little more clearly. When you open up when you take the picture, there's these shutter blades inside of the lens that open up to let light in. And they can open up a small amount or a large amount. The larger they open, the more light comes in. And so when we talk about an f-stop, this is a fraction of the focal length of the lens that represents the diameter of the aperture opening. So for example, if we're talking about an f-stop of 4, that's a fraction of 1/4 the focal length of the lens. So in this case, we have a 100 millimeter lens. And if this camera is set to f4, it's going to open up to 1/4 of 100 or 25 millimeters. So at f4, this will open up to 25 millimeters and let light in. If we set it to f of 10, that's a fraction of 1/10. So it's going to open up to 10 millimeters to let the light in. So with those f-stops, as you go to a higher f-stop, the diameter of the opening is actually less because it's a fraction. Shutter speed is the other important variable you have to worry about. And shutter speed is fairly straightforward. It's the amount of time that the aperture opens up to let the light in. And this can be anywhere from thousandths of a second up to multiple seconds. And there's a reciprocity between f-stop and shutter speed. So as you open up the aperture bigger, your shutter speed is going to be less. If you close down the aperture smaller, your shutter speed is going to be more. And they both result in the same amount of light coming in to hit the sensor. There is a series of what's known as f-stops. And these are the f-stop values that are one stop apart. And basically you just have to memorize a series. And it goes F2, F2.8, F4, F5.6, F8, F11, F16, and F22. And that might sound like gibberish, but the opening at F22 lets in half the light of the opening at F16. And the opening at F11 lets in twice the light of the opening of F16. So as you're moving up and down, it's called stopping up, stopping down. Those are called stops. And the reciprocity is that if you have an exposure at f16 at say 1 second, when you move to f22, because it's half the diameter of the aperture, you have to double the shutter speed. So it's going to be 2 seconds. Likewise, if you go step down to f11, that's going to be half of the exposure. So it's going to be half a second. So you really have to understand that f-stop and shutter speed are reciprocally related, and as one goes up, the other goes down. So why do we care about f-stop and shutter speed? Well, there's some practical considerations that determine the quality of the final image. When you're talking about the f-stop, as you stop down the lens to a smaller opening, you get a greater depth of field. In other words, more of the photograph will be in focus from near to far. As you open up and have a very large f-stop, less of it is in focus. And you might have a selective focus, so only, say, when you're looking at a snake, maybe only its head is in focus and its body is out of focus. When you're talking about shutter speed, you might want to choose a faster shutter speed because you need to freeze the action, because as we know, snakes don't like to sit still for very long. So you need that fast shutter speed so the photograph isn't blurred. And you always have to balance the f-stop with the shutter speed and hopefully get the results you're looking for in the given light. And that's where the third variable comes in, and that's the ISO setting of the sensor, or the sensitivity to light. On most cameras, ISO 100 is the least sensitive, and as you go to ISO 200, it's going to be twice as sensitive to the light. Therefore, you would only need half of the exposure in terms of the shutter speed time. 400 is twice as sensitive as 200, 800 is twice as sensitive as 400, etc. However, as you increase the ISO, you're going to introduce digital noise, which results in less detail in your image and maybe these static looking effect. So that's another thing you have to balance. And that, in a nutshell, is photographic exposure. And if it sounds like a lot to keep track of and somewhat confusing, it probably is. It took me a while to really understand these things, and I had to work it out in practice in the field when using my camera. So I really recommend that you find other sources, books, videos, websites, etc. that go over photographic exposure. But in practicality, most cameras have settings which make it possible that you don't have to worry about all these things. Some cameras have a fully automatic setting where you just point and shoot, and the camera makes the decisions for you in terms of f-stop, shutter speed, and ISO setting. Others have a really great features known as aperture priority and shutter speed priority, where basically you set the aperture you want, the camera will determine the other two settings, or you set the shutter speed you want, the camera determines the f-stop and the ISO. And that's really great with snakes, because if a snake is moving and you know you need to shoot at 1/60th of a second or faster, you can just set your camera on shutter speed priority to 1/60th of a second, and the camera is going to select the other two things. So I would recommend you definitely seek out a camera that has shutter speed priority and aperture priority, and I believe pretty much all of the SLRs have this. This is a very basic function for today's camera. So I thought I'd end the video just by showing you this 2-year-old holdback Hog Island boa female. And so this is one that's probably about 3 feet long or so. Just really beautiful light colors. I just love the speckling and the pinks and greens and oranges. Hog Islands are one of my favorite locality boas. In fact, I have a pair, or a gravid female right now, who I'm 99% sure is gravid, and the babies will be full siblings to this animal. So I'm hoping that these babies will be available later this year, and this gives you an idea of what they look like at 2 years of age. Just gorgeous, gorgeous animals. So I hope this video was somewhat helpful. Photography, of course, is a huge topic, and as I mentioned before, I urge you to go seek out other sources of information on camera choices, exposure, and other topics in photography. And I look forward to our next video on photography, where I cover some other topics. Probably I'll cover composition in the next photography video. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thanks for tuning in, and enjoy your boas.